d'être là. Je m'appelle Frédérick Gagnon. Je suis titulaire de la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand en études stratégiques et diplomatiques ici à l'UQAM. Je suis aussi professeur au département de sciences politiques ici à l'UQAM. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette table ronde sur le thème Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World. And I want to introduce you to Paul Lenze, who was the leader on that project and who proposed to organize the roundtable today. Paul Lenze is a teaching professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Northern Arizona University. He holds a PhD in political science from Washington State University, a certificate in political psychology from Stanford University, MA in International Relations from the University of San Diego, and a BA in Political Science from the University of Washington. And he is also on a sabbatical leave this semester from Northern Arizona University, visiting us at the Raoul-Dandurand Chair for the whole semester. So he's also currently an associate researcher with us at the chair, working on the Middle East, working on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and many other topics it will address today. So Paul decided to hold the roundtable, proposed us to hold this roundtable, and I'm gonna pass him the puck because we're in a hockey country. I'm gonna pass him the puck so he can explain what we'll do today.
Merci Fred. Merci à tous d'être ici aujourd'hui. Je pense que nous n'irons pas aussi longtemps que le match des Blue Jays hier soir. Je suis désolé, j'apprends le français, donc je vais parler en anglais. So what we're going to do today is we're each going to give about 5-minute opening presentation of our views on the topic of foreign policy in a multipolar world. We have experts on Canada, U.S.-Canada relations, on China, and on Russia. And then after our opening presentations, I've developed some questions, and then we'll engage in a discussion. And then we'll spend the last part of the conference taking audience questions. So I will begin with the American foreign policy perspective. The perceived American retrenchment in the Middle East since the 2003 Iraq War allowed Russia and China to expand their economic and military influence in the region. The resulting sectarian conflict, civil wars in Syria and Libya, increased proxy support for non-state actors in these civil wars, as well as conflict with al-Qaeda and ISIS, has led to increased competition among Saudi Arabia, Iran, and even Turkey, who are all pursuing more aggressive foreign policies because of the power vacuum created in the Middle East by the United States' toppling of Saddam Hussein. While while Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and the Gulf states have all been longtime allies of the U.S., the instability of the region between 2001 and today has forced these American allies to diversify their strategic partnerships within the Middle East. And America's long-term commitment to the region is perceived as being in jeopardy during the first Trump administration and even in today's second term of the Trump administration. Both Russia and China have sought to capitalize on this by supporting proxies and regional hegemons such as Iran to challenge U.S. influence in the Middle East. Often this support was done in return for resources, but the potential for increased conflict in the region continues since authoritarian regimes and Islamic fundamentalism have thrived because of the power vacuum created by the United States. Since the October 7th attack by Hamas against Israel and Israel's subsequent occupation of Gaza, the Arab-Israeli conflict has become front and center once again in Middle East regional security. Regional hegemons, such as Iran, took advantage of what it perceived as Israeli preoccupation with its war against Hamas to launch 2 drone and missile attacks against Iran in 2024. And the United States also would attack Iran's nuclear facilities. The U.S.'s support of Israel helped to thwart these attacks. But at the same time, Iran's influence in Syria and in Lebanon has declined, and new regional alignments are developing. You know, as the new Syrian government is seeking to build relationships throughout the region, and there is still the threat of a growing Iran hegemony. So the last few years in the Middle East have seen a shift towards a multipolar regional order. The U.S., Israel, and many Arab states now have a common goal to free the Middle East of Iran's influence. This is actually a rare consensus. But Middle East security will be difficult to achieve without foreign assistance and engagement. Iran has substantial influence in Iraq and Yemen, as well as continuing its pursuit of nuclear weapons. While the Trump administration sought to implement maximum pressure with attacks on the Houthi in Yemen and pressuring the Iranians back to the negotiating table for a new JCPOA. These negotiations are now dead, given the fact that Iran was attacked by the United States. A stabilization strategy for the Middle East will need the support of a more responsive and transparent governments around the region that are able to retain a monopoly on the use of force, deliver prosperity to the people, and be willing to confront Iran's influence. This is a monumental task that will be very difficult to achieve. And as we've seen with the Trump peace plan in Gaza, there's already trouble in trying to maintain security in the region. At this crucial moment in the region's history, American, Russian, and Chinese interests are not converging. Sectarian divisions and geopolitical ambitions remain. Subsequent U.S. actions in the Middle East to respond to Russia and to China have only precipitated further conflict. And this is not just in the Middle East, but as we'll talk about today, it also includes Europe, Asia, and even in Africa. And I argue that this is causing a decline in American hegemony. A famous realist named Henry Kissinger argued in his book on world order that a quarter century of political and economic crises perceived as produced or abetted by Western practices, along with imploding regional orders, sectarian bloodbaths, terrorism, and wars, ended on terms short of victory. And this has thrown into question the optimistic assumptions that the spread of democracy and free markets would create a just, peaceful, and inclusive world. So as many scholars have written the last 10 years, there will be many challenges that confront our world, whether it's future pandemics, environmental issues such as climate change, global trade. We live in a world where more voices are being heard. Instead of challenging long-term allies, the United States should recommit to working with international institutions when necessary and even work through multilateralism. If the Trump administration continues on this current trajectory of transactional diplomacy, maximum pressure, states will seek to realign and create the potential for future conflict. And so now I'm going to open up the floor to Justin, who will talk about Canada's foreign policy in our multipolar world.
Thank you, Paul. I wish that your recommendations were heard and implemented in Washington, D.C. by the Trump administration, because if it's not, Canada is facing a very bad scenario of a combination of multipolarity and retrenchment. And the last time that happened was in the 1930s, and that decade did not end well for Canada. We ended up going to war in Europe without the United States for 2 years. Canadians fought and had to defend their country without the support, the explicit support of the United States of America. And I fear that the same logic of Canada being involved for European security will lead to a scenario similar in the coming years. Because the motivation behind U.S. retrenchment has caused a lack of the destruction of the trust relationship that had been built over decades. We can see it on the trade field, of course, as you can see that whatever happens on TV can have an impact on U.S. Trade policy. But on defense issues, it's more than just the cost of things we're going to pay for. It is the cost to defend a country or to go to war in Europe without the U.S. support that is in question. And so, as a consequence, Canada is undergoing a radical transformation of its defense policy. Mm-hmm. I would never have expected to say the words strategic autonomy and Canada in the same sentence last year. This was not at all Canada's defense policy. It has always been to support NATO, to maintain transatlantic unity, cohesion between and amongst U.S. allies. This is the core of Canada's foreign policy. Ever since the Second World War, where we realized that a divided West brought us to war, we needed Americans committed to European security and Europeans committed to U.S. security interests beyond Europe. And when that failed, thinking of Suez in 1956, Canada had to come up with this idea of peacekeeping to a bridge between the French and the British on one hand and the U.S. on the other hand. In the Vietnam War, where Canada had to choose whether to support the United States when its allies refused to deploy troops to that war. Same thing happened in the Iraq War in 2003. Whenever there's huge divides and debates between and amongst its allies, Canada is put in a tough spot. And usually chooses to hedge in between and try to find a bridge of some kind. This is not necessarily possible under the Trump administration in the current situation. And so Canada is undergoing a twin pillar, if you will, defense policy. On the one hand, building strategic autonomy to the level that it is capable. And unfortunately, to implement this will take at least 15 years. Because if you want to have strategic autonomy for defense policy, you need to be able to communicate, for instance, among your military, but Canada uses U.S. communication systems. You need your military to be able to use weapons, and Canada's most weapons are U.S.-made. Some platforms, such as ships, are built in Canada, but with U.S. combat systems and communication systems. And so we've put ourselves willingly in a vulnerable situation, which will take years of investing in research and development and production and transfer of technology with more trusted allies to develop that autonomy. So the second path is to increase partnerships with reliable allies, and Canada is committed to reinforce its cooperation with Europeans and South Asians as well, most notably South Koreans and Japanese and Australians as well. It has also had new commitments with the Philippines and Indonesia and other countries in that region. But it is very hard for Canada to compensate for the huge importance that the U.S. represents as a security provider and as a economic prosperity driver of our economy. And in that situation, Canada is forced to not only hedge in between developing new partnerships and increasing its autonomy, it also has to apply what I call a courting strategy, which is to plea to Washington, specifically to President Trump, to limit the level of retrenchment and abandonment of its allies, including Canada, and doing as much as possible to not irritate that very irascible or very sensitive person that is Donald J. Trump. You can see that with the ads, but you can see it with Canada's position on Golden Dome, saying, yes, we will participate. You can't say no to this. We will prevent Chinese investments in our mining systems, critical rare earths and critical minerals as well. Similarly to Denmark, with Greenland that is sought by the U.S. president, there's a need to overcompensate for a desire or perception in Washington that these allies are not committed to U.S. security interests. And so you can see in Denmark the choice of buying more F-35s. Well, I expect Canada not to cancel its order of F-35s, maybe add another fleet, to have a mixed fleet, for instance. But this idea of antagonizing the United States is just out of the question because of the vulnerability that Canada is in. And this is something that is different than the 1930s. And at that time, Canada was not facing a predatory U.S. president, and that's a new thing. And so Canada is trying to manage these three options But one thing is for sure that the option of realignment that you raised, Paul, is out of the question. This is not a possibility. It can be made in some sectoral sectors, for instance, on the current discussion with the Chinese about the electric vehicles, if there's a transactional deal that can be made with Xi Jinping, but it will never extend to the security realm, with Canada not being excluded or seeking realignment with countries that are at odds with U.S. security interests. This is just not an option because it would create a pretext for the United States to be even more unilateral, even more coercive towards Canada. And so this cannot be the option for Canada. And so it comes in a very tricky time where Canada lacks resources to implement this defense and this new foreign defense policy of combining autonomy and diversification. But I fear that besides courting and hoping that we're not too much impacted by the sensitivities of the U.S. president, there's no other choice but to go that way. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to Frédérick Gagnon to discuss U.S.-Canada relations.
Thank you for organizing this roundtable. It's a very classic debate in international relations theory. What kind of global order do we live in? You have scholars who say we're still in a unipolar world. Some say we are in a multipolar world. During the Cold War, many scholars, of course, were saying that we were living in a bipolar world. And you can use many indicators to debate this question, okay? Military power, economic indicators, GDP and stuff. I think it's an interesting debate, but my research focuses on a little more on how Americans perceive that global order. So Robert Jervis was telling us that perception and misperception is very important in international relations. And the debate about what kind of global order we live in is interesting, but what I've seen on the ground in the US is that most Americans now believe we're in a different global order than the one we saw after the end of the Cold War, okay? You were talking, Paul, about the decline in American hegemony. Again, you can debate whether there is a decline or not, to what extent there's a decline, but from the field work we've done, what we've seen is that most Americans now believe that there is a decline, that the world is changing, that China is becoming stronger. We saw also Russia, who did not hesitate to invade Ukraine for the second time after 2014. So other powers are doing stuff in this international arena because they believe that they can do that, because U.S. hegemony is in decline, and many Americans believe that this is the case. And I don't think it's temporary. I think Donald Trump has been normalizing that discourse also, using his presidential microphone and repeating for 10 years now that the American dream is dead. I don't know if you remember his inaugural address in 2017. I have a quote here. He said, you know, one by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores with not even a thought about the millions upon millions of American workers left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed across the entire world. There's this idea that global trade has been bad for American workers, for the U.S. economy. And if you look at this discourse, at this speech, and you compare it with previous inaugural addresses by other presidents, you see a change in tone. And in 2017, when Trump said these words, and you can read the speech, it's very pessimistic about the world. It's very pessimistic about U.S.'s role in this world and about U.S. power, and very different from the optimistic narratives that you would hear before. And in 2017, many people were surprised to hear a U.S. president talking about the U.S. and about the world in such stark, in such pessimistic terms. But Trump has been around for almost 10 years now. He was just reelected for a second term, and it's still the same narrative. But what we see from our field research is that that narrative has become predominant in many circles in the U.S. and many Trump voters also who are expecting Trump to change that situation. And I was going back to John Mersheimer's book yesterday, when that was published, we were kind of laughing at John Mearsheimer because we were like, that's so pessimistic. There's a sentence in there that says, for every neck, there are two hands to choke it. Global powers are going to be greedy. Global powers are going to do whatever they can to enhance their power, military power, economic power. And Mearsheimer was talking in that book about status quo powers and revisionist powers. What is a revisionist power? It's a power, it's a state that is dissatisfied with the current international order and that will seek to change it to better serve its own interests, while status quo powers are satisfied with the existing distribution of power in the current international arrangements. And when Mearsheimer was talking about a revisionist power in that book, he was talking about China at the time, because he was saying China is a revisionist power, it's getting stronger and stronger, and at some point China will try to become a regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific region, and maybe if China is lucky, it will be able to become a global hegemon at some point, okay? And it will do whatever it can to become that kind of hegemon. If you look at the U.S.'s attitude towards many countries in the world right now, and I'm coming to Canada in a second, to me, it feels like the U.S. has become the revisionist power now. Justin was talking about a predatory power a few months ago in an article that I would encourage you to read. So, and I think he was saying pretty much, maybe not the same thing, you can tell us, maybe not the exact same thing as Mearsheimer, but we live now in Canada next to a superpower that will not hesitate to do whatever it can to change the situation, because Trump and many people in the U.S. are dissatisfied with the current international order and with what the world has become. And if you read about the American political culture, the fact that the U.S. Could become the second superpower in the world in a decade or in 20 years is a traumatic experiment. It's a traumatic period for many Americans who believe in the American dream, believed in the American model, and see that other countries are becoming stronger now. So there's an appetite for the kind, and that's going to be my final words, there's an appetite for what Trump is doing right now. What is he trying to do? If you read at Jameson Greer's conference that was given a few weeks ago, he's the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative. If you read Stephen Myran's thoughts about what the U.S. should do in the near future, you see that they want to restructure the global economy. They want to restructure it because they're not satisfied with what the global economy has become. So, and it's not temporary. I don't think it's temporary. Trump started to do things like that during his first term, but now it's more structured. It was from the start of that second Trump administration. And what it means for Canada is, well, you see that every day in the news. Trade wars, tariffs, stronger tariffs than the first time, and they're not sparing any country in the world, and not traditional allies like Canada, because Trump, as you saw on October 7 when he met Mark Carney, he used the word conflict to describe that relationship in the auto sector, for instance. So there's this sense that the U.S. needs to restructure the global economy, even with traditional allies using the tariffs. And you saw that the tariffs are even higher. And I don't think it's temporary. I think it's going to be something we have to deal with for the rest of the second Trump administration, and maybe after that, after the 2028 presidential election, for instance, if J.D. Vance is the Republican candidate and if he is elected president. I'm going to stop here, and then I can come back.
Thank you, Frédérick. Next, we have Emmanuelle Rousseau, who will speak about Russian foreign policy in our multipolar world.
Thank you, Paul. I'm actually going to take over where Frédérick started as well, which is that when we talk about multipolarity, it's not a neutral concept. It's not just an empirical fact either. And especially if we want to look at what Russia does or the discourse around multipolarity. In Russian foreign policy, multipolarity, it's more of a goal than a reality. And it's a discourse that has been emerging for a long time. So it's not something that we've seen just since, let's say, 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has emerged, I would say, at the latest in the mid-90s. And right now in the Russian foreign affairs circle, whether you talk policy or academia, and in Russia, those two tend to go together very often anyways, multipolarity has been constructed as the horizon. There is only one way forward for the world. It is multipolarity. There is no alternative view to this. The idea is, at the end of the Cold War, the bipolar world ended. Then we had this, what some called unipolar moment, but this was always a transition in the Russian discourse. This was always a transition toward a more multipolar world. So the corollary of this is then, so Russia does not need to adapt and become a second-rank power in a US-led order, because the world is meant to become multipolar. And so in the 90s, it's what was called in Russia the Primakov Doctrine, which was the then Russian foreign minister. And so the idea is Russia should support the direction of multipolarity instead of integrating the liberal order. Multipolarity understood as a distribution of power, obviously, but it goes deeper than this. So, and that's what I'm going to delve into a little bit. And so, like I said, this emerged in the 90s in Russia, but so already their effort in the world was to create this multipolar world. And when I tried to look back and say, okay, what are actually those manifestations of this already in the 90s, I remembered that there was, in 1997, a joint Russia and China declaration on a multipolar world and the establishment of a new international order in 1997. So at a time where a lot of people still thought this US hegemony, Pax Americana, whatever you call it. And in a lot of ways, this already paved the way for what we now call the BRICS and all of those non-Western groups. The Primakov Doctrine has had a varied influence over time in Russian circles, but it has had a very, very clear resurgence since the 2020, and in particular since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is abundantly clear in the current Russian foreign policy concept, which was published in 2023, so after the war in Ukraine, and which is now extremely clear in terms of what policy Russia is guiding. And what they present as their vision of multipolarity is something that, yes, is linked to a, let's say, new realist view of the world with poles, and each pole has a sphere of influence that not only exists, but that pole is entitled to. And that the view of the world that Russia calls for is, in a lot of ways, very similar to what you would find in the 19th century concept of Europe. This concept of power with big powers that sort of manage the world, and they all have their own sphere of influence, and you shouldn't meddle in them. And interestingly, Russian foreign policy experts' favorite authors are Samuel Huntington and John Mearsheimer. They love to quote extensively as well. And so this civilizational role of Russia is particularly important. So their vision of the pole is not just a pole as you're a big power, you have a big economy, and so you have influence. A pole is civilizational. The pole has a civilizational attraction and a role. So in this sense, Russia is a civilizational pole, as important as the West or China or Africa. And as such, it is entitled to keeping this sort of civilizational mission, especially in what they call its near abroad, which is basically the former USSR space. And this is very important if you try to think, for instance, of what we've seen in Russia's foreign policy and defense missions since 2022. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the fight against anything that would be considered meddling in internal affairs of those states as well. So this is a very value-based and normative approach. So I'll stop there, but what is very interesting is then that their view is this is meant to be, this is the course of action that will happen, and anybody who goes against this is going against history and therefore should be fought.
Thank you so much. Next, we will talk, or Alexandre Schiele will discuss Chinese foreign policy in a multipolar world?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Frédérick, for having me. I believe that after Emmanuelle's talk on Russia, the talk on China is very apropos because there's going to be some degree of overlap, though in a slightly different direction. The idea that we are moving toward a multipolar world is now almost a cliché, but it remains deeply contested. My remarks focus on how China both articulates and embodies this process of multipolarization as discourse, as policy, and as contradiction. The unipolar moment, the US hyperpower era that began in 1991, is ending, or according to some, has already ended with the 2008 financial crisis. China's paradox is that it prospered within the US-led global order while simultaneously feeling constrained and threatened by it. Since the 1990s, Beijing has made multipolarization a core principle of its diplomacy. Official documents describe a world moving from US dominance toward what China calls, since Xi Jinping, a community of shared destiny for mankind. But this vision is not descriptive, it is normative, as Emmanuelle says. It justifies reforming global governance in ways that dilute Western institutional primacy and expand China's own influence. Multipolarization does function as a revisionist project in Mersheimer's term. Through discourse, investment, and diplomacy, China aims to erode US and Western dominance and to attract emerging powers and markets to its orbit, the BRICS. Yet, despite talk of decline, the United States remain the single comprehensive superpower, whether it's military, technology, or culture. China is, of course, the world's second largest economy since 2016, and now produces roughly $19 trillion of GDP compared with America's 30 trillion, so 2/3 of America's. By contrast, Germany, the third economic power, trails far beyond at around $5 trillion GDP. Trade reveals the deep interdependence between the US and China. In 2024, the US ran a deficit of about $918 billion, while China enjoyed a surplus of roughly $992 billion. Bilateral trade alone between the two countries reached 582 trillions. The United States depends on Chinese manufacturing. That's a given. However, China depends on the US dollar stability and American consumer demand. This mutual reliance undermines the popular Cold War 2.0 analogy. Even though both sides pursue selective decoupling, Washington seeks diversified supply chains and value chain, while Beijing seeks diversified markets. There's a paradox of single buyer, single seller in a market. In terms of soft power, American culture still dominates globally. Few outside China can name a Chinese pop star, while Korean and Japanese cultural exports remain far more influential. Militarily speaking, since 2021, China has the largest navy, but only by the number of ships. Its total tonnage is still about half the US Navy's. From Washington's perspective, China has shifted from partner to competitor in the 2000s. We have already some inklings towards it in the first Bush term national security policy, saying that we will always remain the dominant military power. And although there was this, let's say, misadventures in the Middle East, Obama's pivots to Asia in 2009 marked the first strategic reorientation toward the Pacific since the Cold War. Economic grievances over trade and deficit and the industrialization, of course, as we know, and has been mentioned by Justin and by Frédérick, fueled Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and subsequent tariff. The COVID-19 pandemic deepened mistrust between Beijing, Washington, and US ally. Some analysts spoke of a Thucydides trap, like Graham Ellison, the idea of an almost inevitable confrontation between a rising power and an established power, drawing upon, of course, the Peloponnesian War. And tensions around Taiwan intensified after Tsai Ing-wen's election, although the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine redirected US attention back to Europe, although the situation around Taiwan is still growing more tense. But what about Beijing's side? We know a lot about America's side, but what about Beijing? So for Beijing, the United States had been the primary adversary since the 1950s. It's general trouble for it. And after 1989, the global wave of democratization and American democracy promotion revived regime change fears, whether it's through color revolutions or through direct intervention in the Middle East and around the world. Color revolution narrative reinforced a siege mentality. Chinese leaders assumed that Washington's ultimate goal remained a liberal democratic China. And I believe that Paul would agree that it's still a major goal. Strategically, US and allied positions around the first island chain, that is the Kuril Island, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, if we continue a bit further, constrained Chinese Navy. And Beijing's obsession with Taiwan, which is, in the world of General MacArthur, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Taiwan is not purely an issue of national sovereignty for China, it's also an opening way for protecting its near waters and its shores. And historically, since the 19th century, invasion of China have always come from the sea, whether it's 1839, when the English attack, and then 1856, when the English and the French attack, the French again in 1884, the Japanese in 1895, the eight powers in 1900, the Japanese in 1931, and then again in 1937. And then there's the risk, of course, in 1949 with the Korean War. And for China, 1991, the Gulf War was a traumatic event because it taught the PLA that if it wanted to defend Chinese heartland, it needed to meet the enemy head-on, far from the shores of the country. So to shift to not only a brown water navy or green water navy, but to a blue water navy. China has modernized rapidly. However, it still lags in force projection. It has 3 aircraft carriers versus 11 for the United States, and even the latest one does not match US capacity, either in projection or the number of aircrafts it can carry. The United States remain both a global, of course, and a regional power in the Indo-Pacific, anchored by treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, and informal partners such as India and Vietnam. China's structural weaknesses persist. It has no modern combat experience since 1979. It has lost all its wars since 1962. This is its last victory on the battlefield. It has no formal military alliance in the world, and it is, by its action, fueling regional distrust. Especially its assertive action in the South China Sea and along its borders have strengthened, not weakened, the US alliance network. China may dominate regional trade with the RCEP, for instance, which is the largest global free trade zone in the world, which covered most of continental Asia too and insular Asia, but not regional security. And this is where we have some issues from China. What does it mean? Isn't regional China constrained? Is that domestically China faces also mounting constraint. Growth is slowing. It has fallen from above 10% to 5% this year, last year, and probably 4% next year. The population is aging, the workforce is declining, and the economy remains heavily reliant on debt-driven investment. The growth model is, how can I say, has no steam anymore. Xi Jinping has pushed, since he arrived in 2012, for transition towards higher value export and technological self-reliance, the Made in China 2024, to escape the middle income trap. Because China may well be the second world economic power, But it is, in terms of GDP per capita, it is a middle power. It is on the level of Slovakia. So in order to be able to invest in military technologies and development and growth on the level of the United States, it needs to be at least 3 times the United States GDP. And the paradox is that the post-COVID recovery of China is largely uneven. Yes, we talk about all those imports, but those imports are subsidized heavily. The consumer market in China does not drive the economy. And so, under current conditions, China no longer appears to be on a clear path to surpass the United States in overall power, whether in the short, medium, or long term. And, of course, this does not mean it won't stay the second global economic power, but it will not be. It will not contest primacy with the United States in all spectrum anytime soon, if ever. So, multipolarization is not simply the end of US dominance, it is China's political project to reshape the world order around sovereignty and non-alignment. Yet, the emerging system is less a stable multipolar equilibrium than an asymmetric one, economically centered on China, but militarily anchored by the United States. Thus, avoiding the two-sided trap would not spare us the Kindleberger's trap, a world without a power willing or able to provide global stability as the United States withdraws. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. What we're going to do now is I've developed some leading questions here to kind of spark some discussion. I want to start with the notion of alliances and the historic NATO alliance. Given the fact that the war in Ukraine has, both brought opportunities, kind of re-engaged and reinvigorated the alliance, what do you see as maybe the lessons learned so far from these early years of the Ukraine war? Because it's definitely not over yet. And so where is NATO going from here? And how can Canada assist with this, or should it decouple from NATO? And what are Russia and China's responses going to be moving forward in regards to the Ukraine conflict?
Very interesting questions. 3 I noted, so I'll try to cover all 3 of them quickly, because I will have to excuse myself at 1:30 for another commitment. So where's NATO going? It is currently undergoing a new review of its force posture that will lead in 2 years to new capability targets. And the discussion right now in Brussels are, should we plan for the defense of Europe without the United States? Because the current regional defense plans that NATO works on assume that the United States will reinforce troops that are in jeopardy. So say you have 2,200 Canadian troops in Latvia right now, whose purpose is to defend and deter any invasion of that small Baltic country. But Canada's defense plan is, well, if they are attacked by Russia, either by conventional means, hybrid attacks, or whatsoever, the expectation is that the United States will invoke Article 5 and come to Canada's aid. It is not that we will undergo a national military mobilization to have young men sent to Europe to fight a war where there are 700,000 Russian soldiers right now in Ukraine. Because the West's or Europe and Canada's defense plan are not based on the volume of people, on mass. It is not the way that the plans are conceived. They're conceived based on military and technological superiority, so we don't have to have a lot of soldiers. And now some countries at the national level, say Germany and Poland, are revisiting this. And Finland has revisited before. It has a plan where it has 900,000 reservist people that can be mobilized in the event of war because they fear a land invasion. But Canada does not fear land invasion, so it does not have that sort of plan. He has no plan actually to reinforce these troops because we don't have enough people in Canadian Armed Forces to reinforce them. And same thing for any military equipment. We have a hard time sending currently F-18s, and by the time we have F-35s, it's going to be in the early 2030s. And maybe they will be operational, maybe not. We don't know currently the status of this. And so there's a very fluidity, I think, currently in NATO, because the assumptions on which its defense plans were held are they have question marks now. And there's no consensus on how the United States would react if there was a clear, obvious Russian aggression on NATO allies. Now, I doubt that this would happen. I think that Russian interest, and Emmanuelle can comment on this, has greater interest in doing what we call under the threshold of war operations, such as what they've done in Norway or in Denmark, in Estonia, and Lithuania, and Poland, because it sows discord within NATO without actually going to war against NATO. And so I think that is profitable. But NATO is not ready for this, and so we're using very expensive weapon systems to counter very cheap drones, for instance. And so there's really a flux, I think, right now in strategy. And so I forget the two other questions. I just answered that first one. I'm sorry, Paul.
The first one is that's great because the other two were related to Russia.
So if I can continue on Russia, so I'm not going to try to predict for how long is Russia going to keep trying to conquer Ukraine, but for sure, so if you look at the sort of triangle, Russia, NATO, Ukraine, how does this play out together? So in terms of discourse has been moving on what is the role of Ukraine in all of this, and is it just what we're seeing, a proxy war waged by NATO against Russia? This is one of the leading discourses for Russia, then being any real peace deal would have to imply NATO and a renegotiation of what is the current security arrangement, not just what is happening in Ukraine. But overall, it's clear that the construction of the enemy in Russia is NATO. And I would say at the moment in particular, the European part of NATO, because they're trying to not antagonize too much the US. So the European part of NATO, and part of the strategy, the interest is then, as Justin was saying, is to create doubt, to use the existing tensions, the existing vulnerabilities that exist in NATO to, I guess in the hope of maybe even seeing it implode, because it's an alliance is just as good as its deterrence effect is. It works because people think it works. So if Russia, without having to engage in a real traditional war against NATO, can see doubt that actually if something were to happen to Latvia, let's say, all of the US and all of the other would react, well, then part of the battle is already won without having to go to war. I doubt that right now they would actually try to go to a full-on war on a second front, especially with a NATO country, because it is still starting to be a bit more difficult on the military front for Russia in terms of military equipment as well because of sanctions. So that's where I think we are at the moment.
Question, is NATO relatable to the Chinese situation? Of course, if we're going to speak about NATO, we need to speak about the treaty organization in Southeast Asia, CETO, which has not existed for half a century. There is no NATO in the Indo-Pacific. We have different level of overlapping security arrangement of different level, formal, informal. And we have different military forces and naval forces which act in concert with the US, patrolling and trying to insert freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. It might come as a surprise, but Australia is actually a major regional power. It has combat experience. It has, it's patrolling a wide area of contested maritime territory. But for China, the immediate preoccupation is preventing the establishment of a NATO anesthesia. And one of the major elements that if America has alliances with Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, there's no binding multilateral defense pact linking all these countries. And it's absolutely in the interest of China not to have such a structure. So if there is any conflict, let's say around Taiwan, it will be independent country decision to intervene alongside the Taiwanese forces, or should I say the Republic of China forces. This is the situation there. What China is trying to do is to weaken the US network of alliance in the region, transform its trade relationship, mainly bilateral in the region, into security arrangement. This is the situation with ASEAN, so major trade partner. But what we should not forget is that it's also doing the inverse in Central Asia, trying to transform its security partnership, China's security partnership, into trade alliance with its own interest. The situation in Ukraine is quite interesting because we always speak about America's strategic ambiguity, but China's strategic ambiguity towards Ukraine is that China has not condemned the Russian invasion, but it has opposed the annexation of the varying oblast in the east side of Ukraine. It does not, to my knowledge, furnish military equipment directly. It has not sent troops like North Korea. And it's trying to play still both sides. It wants to be the responsible partner in the world. It has all interests of seeing Russia win, but not for winning as such, but as for maintaining US military presence in Europe and, to some extent, demilitarizing the Western Pacific, where it wants to act, that's for sure. The other lesson is that, of course, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we all feared the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And so the lessons is that such a war would be very complicated for China to invade. So they are learning very closely the situation on the ground in Ukraine. But it has learned, according to experts, that it may not as yet mount a successful invasion. I mean, which will be swift enough to prevent reaction by Western allies, considering there are closer military and security links with Taiwan than there is between NATO and Ukraine. Thank you.
All right. I believe Frédérick had something he wanted to
maybe
add.
Just a few words about the future of NATO and the U.S. debate about the role of NATO in today's global environment. Well, we know what Trump has been saying about NATO. What I would say is that there's a new generation of leaders in the party that are repeating those kind of arguments now. J.D. Vance being one of them. He was born in 1984, so Europe security is not a concept for him. He don't think it's a priority. He don't think so. To your question, what happens if a NATO member is attacked in the future by Russia again, and you have this new generation of leader in the White House? I don't know what happens, because they don't believe as much in that organization as the previous generation, and in Europe's security as the previous generation. It affects, what they say about NATO affects how public opinion on the Republican side perceive that organization. So I have a poll just in front of me, a Pew Research Center poll, that shows that 45% of Republicans have a very or somewhat favorable opinion of NATO. That's lower than what we've seen before. We'll see what happens with that if you have Trump, J.D. Vance keep repeating that NATO is not important. The good news, if we believe in the future of NATO, is that because of polarization in the United States, sometimes when a party says something about NATO, the other party takes the contrary opinion. You know, so support the support for NATO has been higher in the last years among Democratic voters. Of course, because Joe Biden was saying, you know, it's important to support Ukraine and to work with NATO allies and blah, blah, blah. But there's a reaction on the Democratic side to what Trump has been saying about NATO because of polarization in the U.S. So depending on who wins the next presidential elections, if it's a Democratic administration, for instance, I think the future of NATO is a little... I would be a little more optimistic about what happens if a NATO member country is attacked by Russia and it's a Democratic administration that's in the White House.
And I just want to ask you one more question, Justin, before you get out of here. In the literature in political science and in foreign policy, Canada is often referred to as a middle power. Given what you've been saying today and in our conversation at lunch, do you think Canada's power is declining? You know, is Canada going to be able to engage in the NATO alliance in this multipolar world, given all of the limitations that you've been discussing today?
So I would qualify Canada as a regional power without a region, and that's its problem. And so, yes, Canada's relative power has declined. It has declined from a relative point of view just because of the rise of other countries. That is not because of Canada's choice. But in absolute power, Canada's power has declined as well, which is not the case for many other countries. And this was a political choice. So in the 1950s, when Canada invented peacekeeping in Suez, it sent 1,100,000 troops on the border to prevent the French and the British from disturbing in NATO because the United States were not supporting their support of Israel. Well, at the same time, Canada had 6,000 soldiers in West Germany, 12 aircraft squadrons in Western Germany and France to deter a Soviet invasion of West Germany and France. It had much more power, much more naval power. It had an aircraft carrier, which we don't have anymore. It had multiple aircraft jets. It had capability. It invested in in the northern set of radars to detect Soviet bombers coming in the territory. And that was in the 1950s. And it took part in the war in Korea at the same time. In 1951, Canada was spending 7.5% of GDP in defense. 7.5. Now we're talking about 3.5, which is going to be impossible to meet in Canada. This was Canada in the 1950s. And starting in 1960s, there was a decline in investment in diplomacy, in defense, and in foreign aid, all the way up to today. And so this rebuilding that Canada is undertaking now in the last 6 months is seeking to overcome decades of decline. And that's why I'm saying it's going to take time and commitment. And during that time, we created an État-providence, I don't know how you say that,
welfare state,
where social programs are now taken as a given, for granted by Canadians. And so by investing more in foreign policy, defense, etc., is actually reducing what Canadians are expected to have in terms of social support. And it's going to be much harder than the choices we made in the 1950s. And unfortunately, I have to go. But thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Okay, I want to follow up a little bit more about Russia and China, and then we will take some questions from the audience, both in person and online. The question I have has to do with the contestation around the liberal order. Beyond contesting the liberal order, what concrete steps can Russia and China take to build or institutionalize the multipolar world that they're envisioning? What steps will Russia and China do to create this multipolar world?
Well, I guess that's the big question when you try to understand Russian foreign policy right now. So like I said, in a lot of ways, the Russian multipolar view of the world is very linked into trying to destroy or attack the liberal international order. But when you get actually deep into, okay, what do they actually want then? What would a multipolar world that would look like what Russia looks like, it's getting a little bit more murky. It's because it's not something that is as structured as what we know right now, at least in terms of the liberal international order. What we know is that Russia invests a lot in regionalism, so different regional organizations, whether they're very formal or more informal, regional groups, but with still this idea that in a multipolar world you have different normative groups, poles, and so there is not a need for a universal version of values or view on rights and everything. So it has been through establishing some organization or investing a lot on this. We've been talking about the BRICS, which have expanded in part through Russia, China leadership in this. And also they have other organizations, especially around Central Asia, Eurasia, and Alexandre had already touched a little bit on this. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which had this summit in September. It was considered the biggest summit ever had, was in China. You have the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a bit more of a military alliance, also around mostly Central Asia and China. But those are to a certain point limited. They are not a replacement to what we know of a more worldwide, universal, world-spread view or institutional architecture. Officially, the Russian position is that they are a very big supporter of the UN and international law. So in their world, what it should look like is more international law and more UN. When we see what Russia actually does at the UN, they're doing the opposite. They're blocking a lot of things. They are preventing the UN from working, but under the idea that right now the UN is governed through liberal rules-based order, which is not international law. But they haven't made that much effort to create another version. They push the idea of international law. But the debate, and I think for me the difficulty here is that at the same time we do know that while Russia officially does promote a lot international law, they are also one of the countries that tends to not respect it that much, including real treaties. If you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you don't have to go to informal rules to find a lot of laws that are broken in terms of international law. So I think we're still at a crossroad here, and I guess for the last, since the 90s, Russia's policy has been more on the first side, which was destruct the liberal order, and is now a little bit more in a floating stage of what do we do now that it seems that that order is actually maybe crumbling. So I guess it still remains to be seen.
Okay.
China is interesting because China does not do simply state-to-state relation, but also party-to-party relation, organization-to-organization relation, and person-to-person relation. So all its foreign policy and foreign relation are deploying transcend different things that would not fall under traditional foreign policy or international relation. So one of the most active organization is the United Front Department. That's a very good entry into what China does in order to win support for its cause. So the United Front Department is an old section of the CPC, the Communist Party, and its aim is to create front relation and to rally non-communist personalities to defending the CPC's cause. And so these organizations work for front, universities, academic NGOs, and they do influence operation, corruption. They work through journalism as well. And so they use these tools in Australia and in New Zealand. And Mary Brady called this China's magic weapons. This is one way of influencing, gaining support in local election, in local parliament, over policy, so it's not necessarily a dialogue. On a more formal level, China prefers bilateral relation to multilateral. So it negotiates country to country. So as a big country, it has the bigger hand of the sticks in these negotiations with countries like Sri Lanka or Laos or the Solomon Islands, and trying through investment to not necessarily, so they're failing to bring them to a security network, but they manage through informal situation to ensure at best support in international forums through the different plans and information, or abstention. So China is not in a minority in the different councils. So it uses the international structures against the liberal-based order. So we can say that they're making the UN structures and international governmental organization work, at least formally as they should. But you would be surprised by two things. First, we all know that Russia does a lot of blocking, like the US on the UN Security Council. But China usually abstains. So we forget about it and considers that even if it ratifies treaties, only Beijing or the CPC is in a position to interpret international law as pertaining to China. So this is one thing. Second, China is a very large provider of peacekeepers in the world. This is something that we tend to forget. They're not military, actually they're police peacekeepers, but so it's very involved in all the structure that from an American standpoint we tend to forget, because as through American primacy, we tend to see these things as, let's say, secondary. But for the rest of the world, for countries like Africa, UN organization, different intergovernmental organizations, NGOs are very important, and through these, China gains significant influence in the developing world, in Latin America as well. So this is the way, on different levels that are very difficult to follow.
Frédérick, do you have Canada's positioning on all of this, on the future of the world order, or is there questions?
Well, I can say a few words about that. For Canada, you know, when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister and Trump was re-elected, Justin Trudeau and that government decided to change the foreign policy strategy and go back to an America First foreign policy. Okay, when Trudeau was elected in 2015, he was saying, you know, Canada will be back, will play an important role in the world, will play a role in Mali, will be back in the international organizations, we'll have time to do a lot. Then Trump was re-elected, and they really focused on the U.S. because they had to manage that relationship 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 30 days a month, 365 days a year. I think you got my point. So they had to renegotiate NAFTA. They had to focus on the management of that relationship, and they didn't have much time and resources to do more than that. And I think we're in that kind of movie again, with Mark Carney trying to seduce Trump and trying to convince Trump to stop the trade wars and stop the tariffs. And you know, there's this world out there, but Canada will be focused on managing that relationship because Canada has become too dependent on that relationship. Okay, 75% of what we export throughout the world goes to the U.S. We're really dependent on that relationship. And I would add that Canada has a tough relationship with three other superpowers we've been talking about today, with Russia, with China, and also with India to a certain extent. So it's hard for Canada to, you know, we talk about diversification, we talk about the fact that there are other opportunities in the world, not just the US, but the truth is that it's very difficult. It takes a long time to restructure those relationships, and Canada has to focus on the US. It's going to be like that for 2 or 3 years, at least.
All right, thank you so much.
And even way more than better.
Okay, well, merci beaucoup to my colleagues, merci à mes collègues, and passez un bon après-midi.